Driving Deeper Discussions. Hello, I'm your host, Randy Isaac, and I'm here on behalf of the American Scientific Affiliation, where we are providing an opportunity here for discussion of the articles and book reviews that are published in our journal, Perspectives on Science and Christian Faith. And we are now, in this quarter, we are discussing the September 2022 issue of the journal. And in particular, we are focused on the featured book review. And the book review that we are discussing is about the book titled Thriving with Stone Age Minds, Evolutionary Psychology, Christian Faith, and the Quest for Human Flourishing. It was written by, the review was written by Roger Bretherton, who couldn't be with us for scheduling reasons, but we are delighted to have the author, Justin Barrett, who wrote it with Pamela King, but we're delighted to have Justin Barrett with us today. Welcome, Justin.
Thanks very much. It's good to be here.
All right. Now, Justin, a number of us know about you. I remember you particularly for the talks you gave at our annual meeting in 2016 at the Azusa Pacific. And that's, I think, the first time I really met you. But I suspect some of the people here are not that familiar with you. So let's take a little time and introduce you to them. Let's start from the beginning. Where were you born and raised?
I was born and raised in California, parts of Southern California, mostly rural-ish parts of Southern California is where I grew up. Small town in rural Southern California. Yes, it's now that almost doesn't exist, but then it did.
Right. Closer to LA or to San Diego?
Closer to LA.
Okay. All right.
Just north of LA. Just
north, but away from where the fires always happen, right? Okay. So you grew up there. Where did you go to school?
I did my undergraduate study at Calvin College, now Calvin University.
How did you get that far away from California? You didn't stick close to home.
I did not. I'll tell you, I was looking for a Christian college, but not one that had lots of behavioral requirements. I wanted to be able to dance. Okay.
That's start of your downfall. Yeah.
Really. No, I was captivated by a description I read of Calvin about how they really integrated in the classroom, and that's what made it a Christian university. And so that drew me out there to Michigan. And so I did my undergraduate there, and then
and what was your major there?
Psychology.
Psychology.
I started as a biology major, but then rebelled.
So what attracted you to psychology?
Well, like I said, I started as a biology major because I sort of grew up as one of those nerdy kids, like maybe some other people on this call, where, I just loved being outdoors. I loved interacting with natural things. I even, with a friend, set up my own little biology lab, not knowing what I was doing. And we did dissections of various things that we came across humanly. And I was just fascinated by the complexity of living things, especially animals. And then when I discovered, I was forced as just sort of part of the distribution requirements at a place like Calvin I was forced to take Introduction to Psychology. And I had no idea there was this scientific face of psychology. There was this thing called psychological science. And I was fascinated by it. For some of the same reasons. I was fascinated by animal biology, zoology, and that was just the wonderful complexity of the natural world. And I remember thinking something along the lines of, if humans are sort of the crowning achievement of God's creation, then that's what I want to study. And
that's neat.
And it's a sort of a baby science compared to some of the others. It's new, so it felt like there are just all of these open questions and all of this great new stuff to do. So
it really screamed of opportunity for you.
Yes, right.
And so where did you go after Calvin?
After Calvin, I went to Cornell University. That's where I did my doctorate. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. And that was in what aspect of psychology?
There it was strangely called human experimental. To distinguish it from the animal experimental psychology, which made up of about a third of the department there. A lot of people know Cornell especially for its ornithology. We had ornithologists in the psychology department, which most people don't realize that happens. But my office was just a few steps away from some birds when I was a doctoral student there.
All right. And what was your thesis topic there?
It was on God concepts and how we anthropomorphize God. I was interested in studying what we call psychology of religion, and then later turned into cognitive science of religion from the very beginning.
Okay.
And so I took cognitive and developmental approaches. I did some cultural work, experimental work, and some developmental kind of stuff with little kids.
Excellent. But where could you find a job after you got that degree?
That's what my dissertation committee was worried about. He said, "Do you really want to do this? You can't get a job there." But my first job out was back at Calvin. So I taught at Calvin for a few years.
Okay.
And, then from there to University of Michigan for a couple of years, and then I left the academy for about 5 years.
Disappeared.
I just disappeared. I retired, and my wife took a job working for Young Life at one of their properties. So Young Life, the youth ministry organization, and we moved to their property in Virginia. I worked at Rockbridge, Alum Springs. So I was a stay-at-home dad, homeschooled my kids. And that's when I wrote the first book.
And that's where you learned psychology from experience.
Got a lot more experience. It was very helpful because I've been surrounded by all of these very strange, nerdy people in the universities. And I finally got to be surrounded by ordinary people, real people who, where you can sort of get a little bit closer to the front lines of, well, how do minds work here in more natural kinds of settings.
That's great.
Did that for a while. We did youth ministry and in Virginia and then in Kansas.
Kansas? What part of Kansas?
Lawrence, Kansas.
Lawrence, KU.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. I didn't have any affiliation with the university, though. I was doing youth ministry.
Okay. All right. Great. But then you came back to academia?
Yeah. Through a very strange series of events. It was actually March, I think somewhere around March 27th of 2006. My wife and I were told that the next day would be our last day on the job.
Got laid off.
Yeah. And as those of us who are in the academy know, that's awfully late in the year to be looking for an academic kind of job. And so it was a little bit of a shock. Didn't know what we were going to do, but so the next day was the last day. And the day after that, I got an email inviting me to move to Oxford to start a new center in the School of Anthropology.
Excellent.
Nobody knew that I needed a job. And had this person contacted me a week earlier, I would have turned them down flat and said, absolutely not. We're happy with what we're doing. But
wow, what timing.
Yeah.
So you went to Oxford.
Yeah, we sold everything and moved to Oxford. And so I joined the anthropology department there and started the Center for Anthropology and Mind, and Cognitive Anthropology, and then the Institute for Cognitive and Evolutionary Anthropology.
Wow. How old were your children by then, and how did they take that move?
Oh, how old were they? I guess my daughter would have been somewhere around the equivalent of 5th grade, something like that.
Okay.
And my son, 6th grade then, or 7th grade-ish.
Yeah. Wow. Did they make the move okay and enjoy it?
It was a little hard for them.
Yeah. More psychology here coming. I hear it.
Yeah, it was challenging. Oxford was not super friendly to Americans on certain levels.
Yeah.
They got lots of blame for the Iraq War, and then they got blame for Americans not joining World War I early enough, and things like that. So they got lots of,
So how long were you there?
I was there for 5 years.
5 years. And then?
And then And then I took a job at Fuller Theological Seminary in the School of
Fuller.
Psychology, where I was brought in to start this the Thrive Center for Human Development. And so I started that. And Pam King was a faculty affiliate with that, and it was within that context that we started working on what became the book. I was part of the review panel actually for BioLogos's Evolution in Christian Faith program, and I encouraged Pam to apply for a grant. I ended up co-writing a grant for her for that we got to work on this book, and to really try to bring together her expertise in adolescent development around this concept of thriving with the stuff that I've been learning through teaching on evolutionary psychology.
Okay, I want to dig into that a little bit, but first let me say, are you still there? I mean,
I'm not.
Because the review states that you are, and I thought that might be old news.
Yeah, old news. I am, and for about 3 years now, I have been heading up Blueprint 1543. It's a new organization. After the Thrive Center, then the new president of Fuller asked me to start an office for science, theology, and religion. We called it the STAR office, Science, Theology, and Religion Initiatives at Fuller. And so I built a little team there, and then for various reasons, we decided to strike out on our own, basically. So we
being the team, the STAR team?
Yeah, the STAR team. And so we still work at the interface of Christian faith and the sciences, with an emphasis on human sciences. And we try to... that's what Blueprint 1543 kind of does.
Blueprint, it's such a common name that tells us exactly what's going on, doesn't it?
Yeah, apparently in branding, you either need to pick a name that's very descriptive, exactly what you do, or something that nobody knows what you're talking about.
Well, I certainly don't have a clue, so help us out.
Well, the 1543 is a year, and that's probably enough of a clue that some people are going to figure out what that's referencing.
Yes.
Sometimes marked as the start of the scientific revolution. It's 1543. So it's sort of our little down low hint towards we're doing something sciencey here. And Blueprint has a double meaning. We want to recognize that the sciences help us see God's blueprint for creation on the one hand, but also we're trying to offer maybe a new blueprint or new roadmap or new models for how the church will engage the sciences as we're headed toward the 500th anniversary of 1543.
Yeah, that's great. So I'm puzzled. Where do you get the funding? How do you get going? How do you keep going?
Well, you don't want me to tell all my secrets.
Well, no, not all your secrets, but just I'm just incredulous. I know what it's like to get funding for the ASA.
Well, some of the same places. So
yeah, okay.
We do, write our own grants to develop projects.
Okay. So you're basically out of grants and
from the Templeton
projects.
We got some startup funding from a philanthropist, and we also do certain kinds of contract work for funding bodies, for organizations that work in this space.
Cool.
We do coaching and consultations. We do event design and facilitation.
Okay. How large a team do you have? How many of you are there?
There are only 4 of us full time.
Okay.
And then we bring in contractors for various kinds of other jobs.
So you get to know each other pretty well. Okay. Yeah. Well, let's get into the content a little bit. Okay. So from what you said, the work that culminated in this book started at Fuller, right? So tell us a little bit more specifically and technically into how this work expressed in this book came together and how you focused on that.
Sure. We were really interested in, our reasoning went like this. The idea of human thriving or flourishing has baked into it some kind of purpose.
Mm-hmm.
So that was already out there in the thriving literature. In order to thrive, that it means that you're living into or approaching some kind of what you're supposed to be, some kind of telos or purpose or whatever. And it occurred to me that one way that a lot of our contemporary world was starting to think about human purpose was from an evolutionary perspective. In fact, among the sciences, the evolutionary sciences are peculiar in the degree to which they're comfortable talking about direction, purpose, and things like that. And sometimes without any embarrassment, even though they might say, well, strictly speaking, evolution is blind, but it's really handy to talk about what things were evolved for, to sort of bake in this sort of purposive language. And so that's one piece of the puzzle. And there was another thing going on, and that is that I was dissatisfied with what was available in terms of Christian introductions to evolutionary psychology. Lots of Christians who are scientists are comfortable with human evolution or evolution writ large. Some are comfortable with evolution. An even smaller subset, though, are comfortable with evolutionary psychology because it carries all kinds of interesting connotations out there. And I'm never thought of myself as an evolutionary psychologist. I still don't really call myself that. And so I really wanted to see somebody write something that helped me better understand evolutionary psychology from a Christian perspective. And I tried to get other people to write the thing, and they just wouldn't do it. So if people are paying attention to my dedication in the front, I'm not afraid to call him out publicly. I asked Jeff Schloss to write the book, and he just wouldn't do it. So,
all right.
Somebody's got to write something. So
somebody's got to write. Yeah, we got the benefit of you.
So that was the motivation behind it. Is look, I want to introduce people to evolutionary psychology, but instead of doing an apologetics for it or just describe it in a abstract disciplinary kind of way, what if we apply it to this interesting problem that Christians should care about? What's a thriving life? What does it look like? What are the obstacles to living a thriving or flourishing kind of existence? And can an evolutionary psychology perspective give us new insights? And what are its limitations? So that's kind of how we got to this.
That's great. Okay. Well, I look forward to having a discussion here with you. And so I don't want to keep our audience waiting any longer. So let's Dana, let's go ahead and unlock the microphones, and we'll start with the submitted questions in advance. And we've had one in advance. So usually we have a few, but Del Kuhn is faithful in providing a question every time. Appreciate that, Del, and we'll give you first chance.
Okay, thanks, Randy. I think I'm live. And Justin, thanks for the book. I appreciate the thoughtfulness of an approach of our nature and our niches are different, which is kind of a mismatch. And my question really comes out of Chapter 4 about social mismatches, but I think it's more general. I'm thinking of two different approaches to morality. C.S. Lewis's in The Abolition of Man, in which he considers the moral law external to us and existing on its own, and gives examples of how various peoples in various times have applied the external objective law to their own societies. In contrast, Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra, in which he says that people who are burdened by morals need to become, among other things, a lion to throw them off and then a newborn baby to make their own morals. So my question is, how much of our brains or minds are pretty much locked in because of our biology and our evolutionary heritage, how much can be changed from generation to generation to adjust to the new niches we find ourselves in? And I don't really want to limit my question to morals. I think that's a little bit more general about anything we use our brains and think for. So over to you.
Okay, thanks. Nietzsche and Lewis in the same question, huh? That's a rough start. Uh, but it's a really good question. And it is a central theme. So you've done a good job identifying what's kind of a recurring issue in the book. Your question was, well, how much, basically, another way of phrasing this, how much flexibility, how much plasticity do we have? And how much is kind of fixed? And it's a difficult one. There's no sort of general answer to that, right? It depends. It depends on the particular sort of domain of thought or of feeling, of emotions, of whatever that we're talking about. But as with that caveat, I like to think of it as something like, in fact, I think I use the metaphor of some kind of an elastic kind of leash or something. It's like being on a bungee cord. So on the one hand, there are lots of people who have taken the view that human mind is a tabula rasa, that it's completely blank slate. It's completely sort of cultivated by environmental factors. And so we have all of this flexibility. And usually this leads to a wide open kind of humanist optimism. We can become anything we want, just with the right kinds of environments. And to that, we'd say, well, no, it sure doesn't look like. There's plenty that sort of emerges as an ordinary natural course of human development that we see even in infancy. And experimental studies show that a lot of this stuff isn't just grown out of by adulthood, but you have to work awfully hard to override some of this, and you can't. It just sort of gets locked in. But then there is the other extreme, and the other extreme is this sort of brutal nativism that we're somehow fixed, and there's no flexibility. The truth is somewhere in between. What I think, and it depends on which domain we're talking about. But when we're talking about complex concepts like certain morality, morals, for instance, and I know your question isn't just about morality, but it's a good one because it gives an example of where our moral thought is a product of how we evaluate certain kind of information around us. It's a product of our feelings, much more than we realize. There's been this very strong recent move, thanks to the work of folks like Jonathan Haidt, on how we seem to have these really emotional kinds of reactions to certain kinds of moral situations that sort of happen to us first, and then we backfill rationalizations oftentimes, suggesting that emotions have a much stronger role in our moral judgments than we realized. And it looks like a lot of those moral kinds of engines that drive our judgments about what's right or wrong tend to be very recurrent across cultures, suggesting that there's a real natural anchor there. Okay, so they are part of our human nature, but then they get culturally elaborated in very specific kinds of ways. Or even in idiosyncratic ways. So I, as an individual, could work really hard to override my natural tendency to think that people who eat disgusting things are also disgusting people. It sure looks like that's a natural propensity. That might sound very strange, but sure looks like it is. And if you sort of remember back to, especially when, early school years or maybe even preschool years, if Johnny eats something that I think is gross, then Johnny's gross. And I'm going to stay away from Johnny because he's gross. And that means he contaminates. Well, why would we have a mechanism like that? Why would we have that kind of a natural propensity? Because what we eat is a very strong in-group, out-group marker. Basically, our taste, what we find disgusting, gets tuned up when we're about 2, 3, 4 years old based on what kinds of foods we're exposed to. And while we can stretch that out over age with more experience and effort, we usually don't. So we get these real regional kinds of cultural tendencies to eat only certain kinds of things. And then if somebody doesn't like those kinds of things, we instantly think there's something wrong with them. Why? Because they're not part of our in-group. They're an out-group member. And what they eat is a very clear sign that they're an out-group member. It's a really nice marker in that sense. Yeah. And it's useful to figure out who's your in-group and out-group.
Right.
Especially if people can sort of masquerade to sort of waltz into your in-group and take advantage of you, take advantage of the resources and so forth. So, I mean, that's just one example in one domain where we can look at, okay, there are these specific natural tendencies in a particular area that have some environmental or cultural tuning up, but it's not infinitely elastic. And those help anchor then our subsequent thinking in these domains throughout life. And they apply to moral thinking, and they seem to apply to religious thought as well. Now, Del, am I on the right track with your question? Uh-oh.
I'm going to say pretty much. I'm also, I didn't want to drift off on my question too much, but I'm thinking if our minds are built to be hunter-gatherers, one of these days we're going to catch up with the requirements of the agricultural revolution, and then maybe the industrial revolution and the information age. But I think that's a little bit beyond. I think that's a little bit beyond what you want to talk about. So yes,
it's hard to know.
You're on target with the variability and elasticity, I think.
Yeah. It's a really good question of so one of the underlying assumptions of the book is that, right, we have something like a Stone Age mind. And it's because evolution is slow and environments change fast. And really the Stone Age in some respects is not that long ago. From an evolutionary perspective, it's yesterday.
It's very short.
And so, yeah, it could take a while. But what's interesting about that possibility is because the niche is changing so rapidly, it's not clear we have enough stability in the selection pressures that there will be this sort of regular, predictable, sequential kind of catching up to whatever is contemporary. We'll probably always be behind in some respects. Wow, now the sun is coming out and really getting me. I have to shift just a little bit.
Shift a little bit. Now, so first let me just announce for those of you who haven't been on the program before, if you'd like to say something, ask a question, or make a comment, go to the reaction icon below and click on raise hand, and I'll call on you in the order in which you raise it. But first, I've got a bunch of questions here myself here. I just want to make sure I heard correctly, and maybe I misunderstood, but it sounds as if you're saying that these universally common tendencies, for example, the moral kind of tendencies that you were talking about, that they derive from this evolutionary past from the Stone Age. Now, is that in contrast to C.S. Lewis's perspective of an external moral law?
No, actually, I've cited Lewis in this regard because what I think we're starting to see is evidence that Lewis is on the right track, that there are these kind of universals of morality within certain parameters. There's some flexibility, some tuning up, but you can expect there to be these at least generally recurrent kinds of moral and other kinds of normative impulses, regardless of cultural condition. Again, there can be exceptions. We do see some cultures that sort of can elaborate certain kinds of deviations from these norms. But in general, no, Lewis's idea, I think he calls it the Tao, is on the right track. That there are these moral tendencies. Now, what the science, of course, isn't telling us is what the metaphysical status of these things is. Lewis wants to say, yeah, and not only do we see evidence of these showing up across cultures, and they're true. They're truth tracking. These really are the right, rights and wrongs. And evolutionary psychology can't tell us that. What it can tell us, or at least what it thinks it can tell us, is something about the consequences of them.
Okay.
So,
but are you saying then that scientifically it is not possible to adjudicate this difference in perspective as to whether the source of this commonality in certain moral law is external, from exterior, or whether it's internal, coming from our developing natures?
Not all by itself, not without importing some other kinds of assumptions and considerations. And I think it's perfectly okay to do that. Scientists are going to do that. But sort of Yeah, and so I'm inclined to say no. The science without bringing in certain kinds of metaphysical assumptions isn't going to get you there. But I don't want to be too dismissive. I think what's often overlooked when we just say, okay, they're completely separate then, theological perspectives and science perspectives completely different in this. I don't think we want to go there quite yet either, because one of the things in Christian reflections on what's right, what's wrong, often has to do with what are the consequences of our behaviors. We can't completely avoid what the philosophers call consequentialist kinds of considerations. And the science helps us see what the consequences are, what they have been, what they tend to be, for certain kinds of ways of thinking, feeling, interacting with other people. So there's some overlap there where the scientific perspective, I think, can inform us in some ways. And this is a real live issue. It's something I'm almost tempted to say, to write more about, because there's lots of discussion in the general public about what's natural, what's natural to us, and that whether something is natural or not, we have the sense of that either gives it sort of the stamp of being okay or the stamp of being definitely not okay. I've heard both kinds of arguments, right? Oh, religion is natural, so you shouldn't believe it. Religion is natural, so that means it's right. And I'm like, well, I don't even know what this religion thing is you're talking about, but certain sexual orientations are natural, so that makes them automatically good, or they're unnatural, so they're automatically bad. And that's a naturalistic fallacy on one hand, but there's something interesting going on with that concept of naturalness, because it sure feels like it should matter, at least within certain kinds of theological parameters. Even the Bible talks about the naturalness of certain kinds of behaviors and brings that into the conversation. Well, how do we adjudicate what's created nature versus fallen nature? And can the science actually help us in that regard? And I think it can at least give us some clues, some hints.
Well, would you say then that there's a little bit of an analogy or a commonality between what those of us in the natural sciences are seeing in the natural world compared with what you and your colleagues are saying in the world of psychology, in which, for us at least, the science, and I'm thinking very much of the evolutionary creationists, they see God's the external force of creation working through nature, working through the evolutionary process to bring about his will and his desired creation. Then are you saying it's something analogous or something similar to that, where the evolutionary development of our psychological natures are then God's way of developing and bringing us to his moral law?
I think that we could make that same kind of argument. That's right. He has, one way to articulate it would be that God has used an evolutionary process, if one is accepting this kind of evolutionary approach to this. God has used an evolutionary process to bring about certain kinds of tendencies in thought, feeling, behavior, that make certain ideas easier to think, certain modes of behavior easier to do, and so forth, that point in the direction that is what he wants for us. More precisely, to have something like a conceptual God-shaped sort of space in us, a whodunit. And I think there is pretty good evidence from cognitive science of religion that we are naturally inclined to think that there's something like a God out there. It's sometimes been called something like a sensus divinitatis, or a sense of the divine, or something in that space, in the Reformed tradition anyway. That certain kinds of moral impulses are already there, so that then when we read in Romans chapter 1 that people have these kinds of natural moral sort of compass built in, okay, now we got some scientific evidence, and we can say at least something that's a little speculative, but at least it's science informed about how they came about and why that moral compass has developed the way it has. So yeah, I think there is something analogous there.
Okay.
Is that enough? Or
we can go on for a lot. We got a lot to go on and encourage anyone to jump in here, because we have a lot to discuss. Because I really want to dig into your nature niche issue. I'm quite intrigued by that. You spend a fair amount of time in your book talking about nature, by which you mean not so much human nature as the environmental nature, I believe, and then the niche, the particular niche that we're in. And you talk a lot about the gap and the kind of processes, the importance of overcoming these gaps. So am I thinking about this correctly, that one of the issues you see there is that nature, our environment, and the niches in which we exist, that they're all changing over time, but they're changing at a different pace?
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Can you explain that a little bit more?
Sure. Yeah, so one of the things that seems to really, that is really unusual about humans, it's not necessarily, it's certainly not unique. All animals, non-animals, all living things change their niche. This concept of niche construction, all change the selection pressures, the demands on their offspring as they sort of go through life. For those who haven't read the book, right? You can think about the way just the oak tree, the shade it provides, the way its leaves that it drops change the acidity of the soil and so forth, change the environment that the baby oak has to grow up in. All species do this niche construction, but humans do it at a rate and to a degree that seems to be completely unparalleled. We are so flexible behaviorally, right? We've been able to invade every kind of ecological niche on basically almost all the major ones in the terrestrial world, right? Without speciating, without fundamentally changing our biology. And that's very unusual, right? We're this weird species that's done that. How do we do that? Well, we modify our environment to fit us. We change what those selection pressures are, often through the accumulation of cultural knowledge, but also the invention of artifacts, clothing, shelter, institutions, practices, cooperative kinds of things.
Tools.
This stuff. Lots of, and so that's a good solution. That's a way to bridge sort of our nature failings to fit this new sort of niche. That's how we seem to solve the problem, is through social information sharing, problem solving, and just, sort of being smart together is how we do this stuff. But but part of that, because instead of us changing to fit the niche, we change the niche to fit us, in a sense. Well, then the niche changes. And then there are always these unintended consequences of that niche construction, which means the next generation now has to do it too, plus anything else that we've inadvertently spun off.
Climate change.
That would be the sort of the big dramatic one, but there are micro ones that I think are in some ways more interesting. And I put some of these in the book. I'll give you a funny one that's not in the book that actually isn't about us, but it's about dogs. Dogs are wearing clothes now. Shoes, right? People put shoes on their dogs, and for good reason. Because dogs are having to walk on streets now that are hot, and they were not, and dogs' pads of their feet are not designed for streets. They're good for sort of dirt, not for streets. And so the poor dogs, their feet get burned, so now they need shoes. Well, now we have to actually create shoes for our dogs. That's another thing that we've sort of added on.
Yeah, hey, I tried that with 2 dogs putting on 8 shoes. Sorry, it didn't work for me.
Yeah, I bring this one up as sort of just a fun example, but of course it works for us too. We have to wear clothes now, which means we need clothes makers, which means we need all the technology around making clothes, because we live in places that we're not suited to live in without clothes. That's niche construction that has spun off these other things. One of the examples I talk about in the book that captivated me was because it was timely for me. I was wearing basically an adult orthodontics to fix my crooked teeth while I was working on the book. And it just sort of struck me as, how silly is this, that to be sort of that the orthodontists tell us that about half of US citizens need orthodontal work. It's like, well, something so fundamental to our survival needs work in half of us? That's terrible. How are we so maladapted? It doesn't make sense. Well, it turns out it doesn't make sense. We did this to ourselves. At least the lead view on this right now is evidence suggests about 150 years ago, people didn't need this stuff. Now they do. And it's not because our genes have changed. It's because we've changed the kind of stuff we eat from early infancy. And so our jaws don't develop properly. So our teeth get crowded. Well, why are we eating stuff that's leading to weak jaws and crowded teeth? Well, we thought we were doing something good. We're providing sort of easy to digest nutrition for babies that they won't choke on and things like that. And other kinds of processed foods that are addressing other kinds of fitness concerns, like just, nutritional ones and calorific ones. But the net result is this unintended consequence that now we need orthodontics as well. We also are all wearing these things because we've changed our niche such that for us to make money, we have to read things. Well, our ancestors didn't need to read things. So that's niche construction that has these interesting, we changed. Now we need people who specialize in these guys. So we keep solving the problems of just sort of surviving and thriving and so forth, but create new problems.
Right.
And it just seems to be we're on the treadmill and we just can't get off of it now.
Okay. Yeah, that's great. Great example. I like that. Let's get on to your questions. Luke, I see you have your hand up. Good to see you back. Unmute yourself and let's ask. Yeah. It'd be good to see you if you can. Okay. Hi.
Thanks for taking my question, Randy. I've been holding off because I'm raking the leaves while I'm listening to Justin. By the way, Justin,
that's what I suspected.
Great to see you again. So I'm not looking very professional. Justin, just a couple questions ago, you made a reference to certain values or behaviors you were asking the question, are they from our culture or from our fallen nature? And I know, you accept the whole idea of human evolution and you make reference to the fact that we have these Stone Age minds. I'm just curious how you portray, how you interpret the idea of the fallen nature in the context of an evolutionary history that we have.
Yeah, great question. The contrast I meant to make, I may have misspoken, was between sort of our created nature, not our cultural created nature and fallen nature is the distinction I was trying to make. So, because we're worried about things like maybe you've heard, cognitive psychologists like to talk about humans have these reasoning biases and heuristics, like the availability heuristic, that ideas that come to mind for us very quickly we think are more likely to be true. For instance, it's a really useful heuristic. It does a lot of work for us, but it can also get us into trouble. Well, is that then a result of our fallen nature, or is it part of our is it good in a sense? Is it part of a created nature? So that's those are the kinds of issues that I was worried about.
So that's the contrast, but now focusing on the fallen nature, I'm curious how you would describe or explain is not the right word, but how would you, getting at the idea that we evolved, humans evolved, and along the way through our evolutionary heritage, we picked up all these values like kill or be killed and steal and don't share and, pass on your genes as much as you can. That's what we grew up with. Maybe I'm going at this the wrong way. The term fallen to me means you're falling from one higher level down to a lower level. And I'm saying, I don't know that we were ever at a higher level. We were. I'm asking the question, didn't we come from a lower level? And then what does the term fallen mean in that paradigm?
Yeah, that's really great. I'd love to just punt that one to the theologians and make them wrestle with it.
Okay.
But to not be too cowardly about this, at least the stuff I'll give to the theologians to work with. So here's some pieces that I think you have to take into consideration. Theologians who are going to solve this problem for us. Well, there is certainly a respect in which lots of our behavioral tendencies we might be inclined to think of as really just not very nice. They're not pleasant. You gestured to some of those. Competitiveness, what you might think of as selfishness and so forth seem to be baked in at a certain level. And then, so I take your point is, you started pretty bad. If anything, we're getting a little better. We're not falling from really pretty bad. But I think of it this way. At a certain point in the human lineage, we become the kind of animal that actually has the ability to exercise a degree of self-control and awareness over these tendencies. So we psychologists often call these executive function things that are subserved by the prefrontal cortex, this part of the brain right here, and which humans have this massive prefrontal cortex like no other species, and no other species for an awful long time. Ours is massive compared to the rest of our brain, and it seems to subserve all of these things where, yeah, I want to, knock down Laird Edmund, who I see is on here, but I'm going to resist that. But it also subserves things, not only that sort of self-control, inhibitory kind of thing, but it helps us do things like think about your perspective. Watch it, buddy. To think about other people's perspective and to then care for them better because I'm thinking about how they're thinking about things. And it also enables us to think about the thoughts of God, for instance, and about you and I both thinking about the thoughts of God together and what God wants from us and how we might coordinate our activities together. My point is that the kinds of cognitive conceptual activities that are subserved by this very special brain that we've had also seems to be the kind of thing that helps us become morally culpable, as well as have a relationship with God. So it has given us something that took pretty crude stuff, and you might think at least gave it the potential to be elevated to an interesting place. But with that ability to be morally culpable, well, then we can really genuinely sin and not just be brutish. I don't think animals are out there sinning just because chimpanzees are tearing apart colobus monkeys. That's just what chimpanzees do. I don't think that's a sinful chimpanzee. But if the chimpanzee had this prefrontal cortex and was doing it, maybe it is. So in that sense, I think it gives us some resources. The evolutionary and psychological science perspective gives us some resources for thinking about, at a certain point, we become a species that really can be morally culpable. And that means we really can sin. And what are the consequences of that? Well, then we're not just self-interested, we can be selfish. And we've shifted there. And we can then, not just by virtue of being the kind of animal we are, inflict pain on others, we can deliberately do it and sort of delight in it. And then that changes our social dynamics in some really fundamental ways that I think can have ripple effects we provide selection pressure on others. We've changed our own niche, our social niche now, that others have to look out for that person who's deliberately hurting other people now and enjoying it. And so you can see where it causes this ripple effect where you really have, in a sense, a spreading of this sin character. At least it changes the selection dynamics such that it's not implausible. But again, there's a lot of theology baked in there that I think needs to be carefully unpacked.
I get it. And I see a lot of what you were saying, I see related to that, this whole idea of the moral influence of atonement, that, God wanted us to do better and gave us some ideas how to do that, and then showed us a better way through Jesus Christ. So there's that moral influence. I guess it's just that term fallen that I'm now asking people to say, okay, what do you mean by that? Because it just carries too much baggage and brings in, if we come from a perspective, I'm repeating myself, I shouldn't do that. There's other people who want to ask questions.
Well,
thanks, Luke.
Thank you.
Yeah, but I like this, Luke. And Justin, you mentioned self-control here. Now, would it be fair, if I understood you correctly here, to say that the evolutionary development of the ability to exercise self-control is also a key factor in being able to sin? That the refusal to control our natures is now an option, whereas in the pre-human or non-human species without that ability to self-control, that there's not an option, so you don't have the same ability to sin. Does that make sense?
You asking me or Justin?
Anybody.
It makes sense to me perfectly. And so maybe, I mean, I like the way Justin put it. He said, now we become, with this prefrontal cortex and this ability to now exercise self-control, we become culpable. We've now been elevated to the position of being culpable. And so maybe in that sense, maybe we can come up with a different word that brings in that. But the term fallen, to me, just brings back the whole Adam and Eve at the tree, taking the apple, that kind of thing. So,
yeah, but it may be more in the sense of falling short, because once you have the ability to self-control, it's not that you used to be able to do it all, not fallen in that sense, but fallen more is that you've got this capability and you didn't step up to the plate. I don't know.
I'm definitely sympathetic to that kind of interpretation. My intuitions run along those lines, that we need to have a certain degree of self-control to be morally culpable. And I think most of us share this. We don't even have to think evolutionarily about this. We can just think developmentally. We think about we don't think that a 9-month-old really is sort of an active sinner,
right?
When they're doing things that just are outside of their ability to control.
But then how did self-control evolve in the first place? What is the evolutionary advantage, and why did humans develop self-control?
That's a great question. I don't know that we've got a real tidy answer for that. There are a lot of suggestions. One of the lead suggestions is this does evolve in a social context, whereby cooperation requires, so there's a positive view on it, that cooperation requires me to dial back certain kinds of things that would be in my immediate self-interest, such that I can share in the rewards of group collaboration, cooperation, and so forth. So there'd be selective pressure in that sense to not just sometimes use these little textbook examples, right? Where if we're all out, hunting the mastodon or something like that, it may be in my best interest to just go ahead and grab a rabbit on the side and, defect. But then we don't get the mastodon, and that's going to feed us all for a long time, and not just us who are part of the hunting party, but our descendants back home. So my inclusive fitness goes down if I'm too self-serving. So there's some selective pressure to be able to resist those temptations, especially if you're a social kind of group. And we are this hyper-social kind of animal. So in that context, there's at least that niche that encourages the selection of certain kinds of reining in our impulses. That I put it in a cooperative sense, but you can think of it in a competitive sense as well. That I want, for instance, I want to look like a better cooperator than Laird Edmund, so that people don't collaborate with him; they'll collaborate with me. So I'll spread rumors about what a bad collaborator he is, and but keep it on the down low so no one knows that I did it. But that takes a lot of regulation, self-regulation, self-control. Getting in other people's heads is we call theory of mind. So understanding everybody's thoughts and perspectives. Well, that actually takes me inhibiting my own thoughts about my thoughts so that I can think about your thoughts. So for me to take your perspective, I have to kind of inhibit my perspective.
Yeah, right.
So
Paul,
they're all built up together.
Yep.
We've touched on this. We've touched on this, but I want to bring this up. One of the most influential and disturbing books I read recently was a book called The Science of Evil: On Empathy and Origins of Cruelty by this man, Simon Baron-Cohen, who heads the Autism Center at Oxford, and says that what we've learned from autism is that the ability to empathize is, in fact, in many respects, hardwired, particularly in the autistic people who, and while we all are on the autism spectrum, they have what we call zero empathy. And it can be either positive or negative, the positive being the autism spectrum. But the negative, the zero empathy negative, are in fact the narcissists, the sadomasochists, and type B personality, implying that in many of these people, they don't have the ability for any empathy, and therefore are evil. And how does that, if that's true or mostly true, how do we reconcile that with original sin, with free will, with God's wrath, God's forgiveness, and hell?
25 words or less.
A real softball question.
I mean, what is implying that even Hitler might be a candidate for heaven because he can't help it. Not to mention all the other demagogues.
All right.
I mean, it's not really evolutionary, although it may be, modern evolution.
Yeah, but in some ways, it's a fair question, though. I mean, really, because Baron Cohen. So Simon Baron Cohen, for those who don't know about him, he really is one of the leading autism researchers in the world. He knows his stuff as far as that goes. Now, can
someone put that link to that book on the chat so we all can access it? Anyway, keep going, Justin. Someone else.
Yeah, and he's got a view of autism that's not, not everybody agrees with his view on autism on this, but he does have one of the leading views on autism, and that is that it is a spectrum, and it is characterized by two dimensions. One dimension is a lack of empathy. The other dimension is a tendency to be really highly concerned with order and systemizing things. And he observes that this being high on systemizing and low on empathy is more characteristic of men than women, just as in general. This is part of his explanation for why it is that people who are severely autistic tend to be men, not women. It's already sort of, he's even called it male-brainedness. Autism is a severe form of male-brainedness, he once said. But you've put the focus on that empathizing dimension of it, and that we see a very strong lack of empathy in at least severe autistic people. So what do we do with that? Because it looks like there's a certain kind of brain damage that can lead to, especially in the sadomasochists, narcissists, and so forth, into what looks like genuinely evil kind of behavior. And I guess my quick thoughts are that is not unlike other kinds of brain disorders that we have. So it is a problem. But it's an even bigger problem in some ways. But sometimes when you see how big the problem is, you can see what the potential solutions are. So we also know that alcoholism is a strongly determined kind of trait. There's a chemical that a surprisingly large percentage of the population have that actually leads them to aggressive and risky behaviors as well. It's called testosterone. And it's a real problem out there. I mean, lots of people suffer from testosterone, and it's associated with all kinds of criminality and all kinds of things that we would say are sinful behaviors. Yes, I'm being funny there, but so it's okay to laugh. Don't look at me so seriously. But it's true.
Don't get me started. I'm a urologist, and I got
all right.
about testosterone.
Yes, Paul.
But so. But the point is, right, we're at least then stepping back and sort of theologizing on this, we're responsible for the capacities that we have. We're responsible for how much control we have over these things. I don't think it follows from that Hitler goes to heaven, but it may follow from that Hitler had some things going against him that some of us don't have going against us. So he's not quite as culpable as we would be if we did the same horrific things. We don't know. We're speculating on that. He could have been completely calculating and completely empathetic on these things. We just don't know. But I think it's worth thinking about what are those both biological and environmental kinds of factors that lead people to really just either unfortunate or abhorrent kinds of behaviors, and take that into consideration when we have a tendency to judge other people, because it may be that they actually really have a pretty bad deal on this stuff. Now, you also raised the question, though, of does this raise issues about sort of God's justice? Why would God allow for some people to be so disabled in these ways such that they are more likely to be sinful? Good question. I don't know. But I do know that it's worth considering that a lot of this is our fault. So back to the alcoholism thing, this apparent natural propensity towards alcoholism doesn't matter if there isn't alcohol around. Mm-hmm. Autism seems to be on the rise, probably for certain kinds of cultural and environmental reasons that we're causing. God's not causing, we're causing. It's associated, you said you're a urologist? So, I mean, autism is associated with old sperm too. I mean, old people's sperm, right? The older the father is, the more likely you are to be on the autism spectrum. But we're seeing this weird demographic shift where people are saying, you know what, I'm going to wait to have kids. And it's leading to birth defects of various sorts, which is kind of interesting. We've decided to do that. We're niche constructing away from the natural propensity to go ahead and have babies when you're 18. And we're telling everybody it's a good thing to wait. Well, first, in some ways it is, but in other ways it has unintended consequences. So I just throw that into the mix and then again say, go ahead, theologians, solve this problem, but solve it with the relevant information on deck, I guess.
I might just mention that testosterone is not only important here, but in many other things, because of all the work that's now being done on the effect of androgens on the fetal brain, not only with regard to autism, but with regard to gender identity and sexual preference. And it's a big topic with lots of questions.
That's right. It's fascinating. I mean, remember Baron Cohen presenting on, a lot of the systemizing and empathizing tendencies are predicted by prenatal testosterone levels and, at 15 weeks gestation, that kind of stuff. It's really, it's interesting stuff.
Yeah. I wanted to also talk a little bit about the three key elements of human nature here that you focused on: sociality, expertise acquisition, and self-control. We've already talked about self-control, but I was struck by your discussion on expertise acquisition. And I've been thinking of that. I think that is a very interesting piece, and we kind of take it for granted, although we see it around us all the time. But you point out that compared with all other species, that humans have a far greater ability for expertise acquisition. So what does that mean, and what are the consequences of that? And that basically means specialization. I mean, we have the ability to specialize. Everybody's able to learn and do that. And as you point out, the consequence of that is that we've got greater dependence on each other, that none of us can make a living on our own anymore. And we simply cannot obtain our own food. We cannot do ourselves. And so this interdependence is growing. And I think what you're saying is that in that sense, acquiring this expertise acquisition skills so rapidly, we've been able to specialize faster than our ability for global cooperation. And we see that in politics a lot recently. I mean, even not just at the level of individuals, but at the country level, and different geographical things means we've got different specialization here, and we've specialized so much, but we need each other. And when it goes too far, there's a backlash against that globalism, and we see all sorts of concerns. So I thought that whole area of expertise acquisition is a two-edged sword, as you're saying. It gives us tremendous benefits, but it's got a challenge for figuring out how to live in that niche.
Well said. Yeah, I think that's right. It ends up, again, I mean, this is the sort of recurring theme throughout, right? Is these unintended consequences of things we do to solve the problems that face us. We are, it is fascinating how distinctive humans are in terms of our expertise acquisition. We don't, and as you said, we don't really stop even to think about it, but some argue that we're the only species that actually teaches, for instance, in the sense of we deliberately say, hey, look, here's how you do such and such, or look at this thing, let me tell you about it. Now, you might think, well, that's because we have language and nobody else does, but there's more than that. It's we seem to have, if not a completely unique, certainly a much more developed ability to share joint attention. So, all of us on this call presumably are actually paying attention to the same thing right now, and we kind of know it. That's a very strange thing to be able to do if you're an animal. We break down problems into simpler versions for other people to learn. We invest in the teaching. We invest in teaching people who aren't even our kin, which is a very, very strange thing to do in the animal kingdom. Well, the teaching is a strange thing. The tolerance of other people's kin in our presence and letting them learn from us is a very, very strange thing in the animal kingdom. So we have all of these kinds of things that do seem to set off humans apart from other kinds of animals. I'm actually a little more muted in my enthusiasm for the expertise acquisition as being sort of unique and special compared to a lot of other writers who have written about this recently, like Joe Henrich at Harvard. He really beats this drum hard. I mean, he and some of his colleagues in the areas have gone so far as to say there's nothing special about human intelligence other than we learn from each other. You read his book and you realize he doesn't really mean that, because you have to have special kinds of intelligence to learn from each other, and he grants all of that. But his point is not a bad one, and it is that for us to survive in all of these different environmental contexts, we need the cumulative wisdom of others who have come before us, and we need to take it for granted under most conditions. And that's, I think, Randy, where there's an interesting tension in our contemporary world, where we've got an eroding trust of cumulative wisdom. Now, and yet it's that cumulative wisdom that actually we're almost entirely dependent on to survive. We need to cooperate with each other. We need to cooperate with each other informationally. One interesting little wrinkle on this is these theorists like Henrich, Robert Boyd, and others, they do emphasize that sort of conservative, go with the masses, the wisdom of the crowd and everything else changes depending on the environmental demands. So that in relatively stable environmental conditions, that is a really good strategy. But their computational models have suggested that when you have a whole lot of variability, there's a rapid change, for instance, then it shifts the calculus toward individual innovation and creativity. But
excellent point.
So we may be in one of those moments where, at least in some societies, but not others, on the globe, that there is pressure to be innovative and individualistic, and then not just trust the sort of received wisdom. And in others, there's still great trust in received wisdom. And those of us who are scientists actually are kind of caught in the middle. We often sometimes think of ourselves as, we're the innovators, we think differently and stuff. Like, but we step back and go, actually, most of what we do is received wisdom from everybody else. And so being very suspicious of all received wisdom would kill science and scientific progress as well. So we're in this funny inflection point that's a little hard to know how to navigate with regard to this special ability humans have in terms of expertise acquisition.
I think that's a very good point, especially noting that as the environment changes rapidly, there's this response, diversity, and everything comes out. That reminds me of the plenary talk at our annual meeting last summer, where what was her name, Jessica Moorman, gave a talk about the environment, the ecological systems, and she talked about Rick Potts's work that showed, from the paleoanthropological point of view, that in the hundreds of thousands to a few million years ago, it was precisely during the periods of rapid environmental change that there was the greatest amount of diversification in the human ancestry and all of this, and which goes along with what you're saying. I mean, when our environment changes rapidly, it's because of our ability to specialize, and it's because of our self-control and ability to see it that we can actually respond, and that makes all the difference. It's a key factor.
Yeah.
Wow, there's a lot here. Okay, who else has got something here? We've gone over our hour, but there's a lot to dig in here. Anyone else have some comments or questions here before we taper off? Terry, you've got a hand here.
Yeah, this is kind of a far out question, but since I've got Justin here to ask it, is there any peace between substance dualism? There's a long history of substance dualism in Christian anthropology, and sort of an evolutionary psychology perspective. Are those just two completely different paradigms that and we have to rethink our Christian theology and approach to things in light of evolutionary psychology and sort of put to rest, or is there a way of bringing those ideas together? Is there actually a soul that lives beyond our physical existence? That's part of our being, part of our psychology, part of our religious experience.
Good. Yeah. Wow, that is that's a tricky one. I'll give my own 2 cents, but with the caveat that I don't have a strong view on this. I feel like I'm pretty open to being persuaded in various directions. So for those who aren't familiar with the concept of substance dualism, I will not give an exhaustive kind of breakdown, but Terry's gesturing toward the idea that there's, in Christian anthropology, traditionally, the view has been that there's something extra than just our bodies. We usually call it a soul. That's a different kind of thing. So it's a different substance than our bodies. And so you might think from an evolutionary perspective, sorry, Luke, what?
No, go ahead.
So there was from an evolutionary perspective, then you might think, well, isn't that kind of tricky? Because if you've got this gradualist kind of perspective that evolution usually presents, then how does that extra something get in there? And, different theologians have said, well, God can do things like, okay, I've got the right kind of physical body that can be an appropriate home now for this kind of a soul or whatever it is to be manifest. I'm picking some individuals out of this population to have that, and he spoke it into existence. He breathed into them, and then they have that. So there is a theological way of talking about it. Now, most people, just sociological observation, almost no one that I know who works in the cognitive sciences is a dualist. From the psychology perspective, and evolutionary psychologists assume monism. That is, they assume that there isn't something extra, but they don't do so because the evidence necessarily compels that. They do that because that's the way they're socialized. They usually don't even think about it. That's just the way it's given. But the evolutionary perspective does raise those interesting issues from how do we zipper these two together? I don't know that there's anything particularly thorny that wasn't already there just because of the evolutionary perspective. Because like I said, I mean, one way to sort of address the problem is, well, God just decides I'm going to take these couple of individuals from a bigger population and I'm going to ensoul them in some way. Why not? And that was kind of the traditional view anyway, is that a certain animal was ensouled because it had the right kind of attributes that would be a receptive sort of vehicle for having a soul. There is a funny, now there's a funny PS, and that is, while very few evolutionary psychologists and cognitive scientists that I'm aware of accept any kind of dualism perspective, the evolutionary study or the psychological study of dualistic thinking suggests that that is the most natural way to think about humans, is something like a dualism. That monism, at least, is counterintuitive and relatively unnatural for us to think. It's hard to think, it's hard to get straight. So there are lots of monists who admit that when they're not really being sort of carefully fastidious about their thoughts, they're a dualist. We go through life as dualists, or maybe Trinitarians, human Trinitarians in a sense. There's at least one other thing, not just the physical body, because it's really hard to think otherwise. And there's, I mean, it's a contentious area of science, but there is some that shows this is maybe the default starting point. And it's kind of an interesting default starting point because it makes it very easy to think about things like life after death, about ghosts and ancestors and things like that. There seems to be a natural kind of synergy there, and disembodied agents of other sorts. Because if God doesn't have a body, but God is a person, or maybe a triune person, it's certainly, if thinking about humans as separable from their bodies, or something about humans separable from their bodies is sort of a natural default, it makes it a lot easier to think about God as well. But that's just the PS. You raised the more philosophical problem that I don't really have an answer to, other than I don't know that it ultimately matters. I haven't been convinced that it does. And it feels to me like the dualists and the monists both have problems that are really thorny and hard to solve.
Mm-hmm. So it won't all be solved tomorrow? Might take a little longer.
If I can just throw out there, I'm very surprised by your answer. So I thought I would guess you would have been much more dogmatic in the sort of a hardcore monist and opponent of substance dualism, and I'm just, it's curious that that you gave the answer that you gave, if I may say that.
Yep. Sure. No, I don't have a dog in this fight.
You're a great diplomat, Justin.
I've got other fights that I'll go after, but that one, no.
Right.
I'm open.
Okay, that's great. Where our time is almost up, where we have to stop. One more quick question somewhere? We got a couple of minutes left. If not, okay. I was really interested in your book, Justin. Thank you very much for writing it, and we thank Roger and Ebstyne for reviewing it, and Jim for publishing it, and Steve. Okay, appreciate that very much, and I hope to see you all next month, December 10, when we will hear from Tony Gelsma. And at this point, Justin, thank you for coming and sharing with us. Farewell.